Are you a robot?
Good. I'm excited to hear an update sometime from you, but this is not the time. This is the time for the emergency episode.
The emergency episode.
This is what
That's funny.
happens when you get a leaked copy of the new EU regulations. And so you got to school us on what has been said. I know you've been posting a lot on LinkedIn, and I've reposted your posts, and it's gotten a lot of traction. I think a lot of people are interested in knowing what is going on and what the implications are. So maybe we should start with just a broad overview first. What are some main points, and then we can dig into each one.
Sure. Well, let's set some context first of all, because I think the idea of having an emergency podcast episode on a piece of regulation that is going to come into force in about 5 years' time is perhaps quite funny. And maybe I am the only person in the world who is totally geeked out on this stuff, but hopefully there'll be at least a few people listening to this episode because they care about this as well. But just to kind of maybe give it like a little bit of feeling in terms of like how I think about this stuff. I mean, I'm a lawyer by training originally, and I never went into practice. But you know, I studied like fossilized laws. You know, I've got a copy here of you know, this is like a 20-year-old textbook from when I studied law, and I've got like the Unfair Contract Terms Act of 1977. You look like you're still living in 1977 with that haircut, but you know, I've got the trade.
Something was going to come up.
I've got the Trade of Goods Act, the Carriage of Goods Act by Road, 1965, the Marine Insurance Act of 1906, and the Bill of Exchange Act of 1882. So this was the shit I was studying 20 odd years ago. And, you know, skip forward 20 years, and here we are looking not at a fossilized law, but a kind of embryotic law. So the way it works in the European Union is a really interesting system. You've got the European Commission that proposes legislation, and then it's like a relay race. They pass on the baton to the European Parliament, which is the political institution that we vote for, or you vote for, because I'm no longer in the European Union. But you vote for the parliamentarians, and they basically take it into law. And of course, we're still, you know, maybe a year or two, probably 2 years away from this actually becoming law, because there's the political process. People will argue the regulation is too strong, the regulation is too weak. And of course, we're going to expect a lot of companies who are going to be impacted by this are going to lobby. They're going to lobby for slightly different requirements. And then once it passes into law, there'll be an implementation period. If it's like GDPR, it was 2 years. So we're still 4 years away, 5 years away from this actually happening. But why does that matter? Well, I'm using an 8-year-old computer. I'm using a 5-year-old phone. I'm driving a car that's 3 years old. So a lot of the AI systems that we interact with day to day are designed to be still around in a few years' time. Particularly if you're an enterprise that's implementing machine learning for different purposes, you can expect that the systems that you're building, designing, experimenting, innovating with today are going to be in production in 5 years' time. Hopefully, they'll be in production in 5 years' time, because that's how you're going to get a good return on your investments. And so I think it really does matter now for organizations to see how the tea leaves are looking. The direction of travel is essentially set. I mean, I think this was the last year. We didn't know. We knew the regulation was coming. What we didn't know is exactly how it was going to be made up. And now we do know. And now we've got a great opportunity to start, everything we build from next Wednesday. And I should say this, we're recording on Friday. This episode is going to go out on Monday, the 19th. And the official regulation will be published on Wednesday, the 21st. So really from Wednesday, the 21st onwards, if you're in the business of building, designing or selling AI systems, you've kind of got no excuse if you haven't started to consider the impact of these regulations. And of course, big caveat, I've seen a leak. So what I've seen is probably from January, we think. So there's probably a few changes which we're going to get caught out by the time Wednesday comes. But we're going to run an event on Wednesday with some experts and some old guests of Are You a Robot, like Sebastian Krier, and other friends as well. And we're going to talk about the impact of the regulations then once we've actually seen the final copy. But I can at least share with listeners today what we're going to see. And I think just one more bit of context, I guess, in terms of like the path we've had to get to this point. Ursula von der Leyen, when she became president-elect of the Commission, she said, "I'm going to regulate AI in 100 days." That was the kind of statement that she made, and I bet a lot of people wish she hadn't said that. Not just people in the tech companies, but people in the Commission who are actually tasked with turning politicians' statements into reality, because it's more complicated than that, right? And the European Commission's high-level expert group have been spending quite a few years thinking about how do we make AI trustworthy in Europe, and also how do we build a innovation ecosystem in Europe. Because one of the we've talked about this in the podcast, and many guests have talked about this. If you put regulations in place, it has the unfortunate effect of slowing down innovation, and you've got to get that balance right. And particularly now, we're living through this kind of crazy economic time. This is a time where Europe wants to be investing and not slipping behind the United States and China further. So getting that balance right is really important. And actually, the regulation speaks to that a little bit as well. So she said this 100 days, I think it was July 18, she said that. What we saw was a white paper in February, it was February the 19th, 2020. And we all read that with interest. I think there were lots of really good bits in that white paper, some few things which didn't go far enough, and a few things which I thought weren't very well thought out. But it's easy for me to say. It's hard drafting this stuff, I'm sure. And then we had a public consultation last year in 2020. And what's great about public consultations is that all the responses are in the public domain, so you can see what Google said, you can see what Huawei said, you can see what Bosch said, or you can see what some pharmaceutical companies said in response. And of course, everyone's got their agenda. Everyone's trying to elbow each other and kind of promote themselves in the process. And then we had what's called an impact assessment. And basically the impact assessment, the way that works in the European Union is that before regulation is published, they basically say, we've got these options. We've got like option A, option B, option C. Option A is like, we don't do anything. And option B, C, D, whatever is, these are the different paths that we can take. And what they do is they say, this is what we think the impacts of the regulations might be. And it's a kind of final chance for those who are interested to kind of say, no. If you do this, if you go down that route, there's all these kind of crazy outcomes that we don't want. And so it was really clear the do nothing option was not an option, because politically it wasn't an option. There's just too much noise about AI, and that noise is political noise. Politicians are talking about the impact of AI on jobs, on the environment, or killer robots and self-driving cars. Everyone's got an opinion on this stuff. So politically, the do nothing option wasn't there. The question was, would the Commission introduce sort of soft law rules to basically kind of gently nudge industry into doing stuff, or would the Commission put some mandatory requirements in place? And my view was last year, and I've said this I think a few times, maybe even on this podcast, that I thought what you need is a balanced diet. You can't just have sorry, I'm probably going to offend your vegan sensibilities here, but don't just eat the meat, or don't just eat the vegetables. You want to have a bit of both. At least that's my own philosophy on food.
And tempeh.
Indeed. So you want to have a balanced diet, and so I think and we had Jessica Morley on this podcast saying, we need to agree red lines. It's an easy thing to do. There's already people that very clear about things that we shouldn't be doing with AI. We need to be making that statement. And so here we are today. We've got this leak in front of us, and we're seeing red lines for the first time, and that's fantastic, I think. And so I think that's a real principle. A sort of real principle step forward, that we've now said there are certain things with AI that is just not okay. It's important to say that it's the application of AI that's being under the microscope here, not the technology itself. So no one's saying you can't, experiment with some newfangled approach to machine learning. Yeah, your approaches and the technology itself is fine. It's the application of the technology that's a problem. So in the draft reg, and obviously this is liable to change by Wednesday. What we see is 13 titles, so 13, I won't use the word chapters because there's actually chapters within the titles, but 13 titles, like 13 kind of sections to the regulation. And then we've also got 8 annexes. So you're going to kind of read sort of the 21 sections sort of together, really. What we see is in Title 2, it talks about prohibited practices, and it's a very short section. And basically, this is what's banned or will be banned when the regulation comes into force. And obviously, the devil's in the detail, and I'm not a practicing lawyer, but the high notes are 3 things. If the AI system is manipulative, if it targets vulnerabilities, or if it's performing social scoring, then it's potentially banned. And here's the caveat: if that then leads to the detriment of the individual. So there's going to be a detriment test here. It's not, if I've done something that's manipulative, but it hasn't. If I've nudged somebody in a positive way, my intention was to help someone, then potentially it's going to fall outside of the scope of this. The problem is, to one person's benefit might be another person's detriment. So I think it's certainly going to make people who are thinking about manipulation of people's behavior, but in a positive way, it's going to make them think twice about what they're doing. And the good news is we've got a sort of sandbox identified in the regulations. So potentially startups who are kind of doing manipulation but for good purposes have an opportunity to do it safely there. Sorry, do you want to jump in?
The hardest thing is going to be who judges that, and how many of these different machine learning algorithms that are already out right now are manipulative. I'm just thinking about, like, if you're being nudged to, say, buy a pair of shoes. For one person, that could be great because I need a pair of shoes. And for another person who's a shopping addict, that could be horrible because that's exactly what they don't need. So how can you distinguish between those two? And does even shopping, like nudging someone for shopping, fall under that category? Right?
Yeah.
Maybe they don't even look at that because it's like, oh no, that's not manipulative.
So I think what we're looking at here is not so much kind of behavioral nudging. I think in the cases where there's also a kind of high risk category, which I'll come on to, which kind of sets a whole bunch of things that you can do these things, but you must kind of follow these rules. And I would argue that actually a lot of that stuff is just best practice anyway. So a lot of the kind of the bad outcomes that you might have for stuff which may be on the line, the way you guard against that going wrong, the way you protect your brand, your reputation, is making sure that all of that governance best practice you have in place, and therefore it's kind of unlikely to have bad outcomes. The spirit of this is around fundamental rights. So essentially the freedoms that we enjoy in Europe, or you enjoy in Europe. It's not too different over here yet. But the spirit is basically AI systems shouldn't encroach on those freedoms. And I think that would be the test of, is the AI system designed to be addictive, so that you develop this compulsion based on a vulnerability that you have, because you are someone who maybe has a slightly addictive personality, and they've managed to get you somehow into this kind of crazy frame of mind where you need to buy a new pair of shoes every day. And if the AI system has kind of led you to this kind of really dystopian outcome where you're spending your entire life working hard to buy shoes every day, then yeah, it's definitely going to be within the scope of this. But I think that's an extreme outcome. There's the social scoring bit is really interesting, because I think, and I wrote this in my Forbes piece last week to people who listen to this week for me. What we see in China is obviously social scoring is talked about a lot. Social credit systems are talked about a lot in China, and what we're seeing now is Europe taking a stand to say, yeah, this ain't okay, and this encroaches on fundamental rights. And what's interesting is not all social scoring would be covered under this. Not all social scoring would be banned. So, you're a situation where maybe how often you log into internet banking might be a proxy measure of how creditworthy you are. And maybe if you log in like 10 times a day, maybe that says you're really good at managing your finances. Maybe it says you're actually not good at managing your finances. Who knows? That's not my field of expertise, but something like that is actually kind of related to the scoring, the impact of the scoring, giving you credit, and how often you log in. Those two things are kind of analogous. But if they took your Netflix streaming history and then figured out that people who watch, people watch like intellectual documentaries are actually like really bad credit risk, and people who watch kind of trashy movies are actually somehow like really good. If someone figured out that correlation using the data, and I'm sure you could. I'm sure there is a data correlation between your Netflix streaming history and your credit score. But what the European Union says, no, that's not okay. You can't take data from one thing or mix data together from different sources that are unrelated to the thing. That is going to have a lot of impact on a lot of people I know. So that's really interesting. So if you're doing that in the European Union, our European citizens move to America or China, is my advice.
So
and then
wait, before we jump forward on that, because that I think has a lot of implications. So you cannot mix data from one place to make an assumption about another place. Like if it's in your Netflix. Okay, then yeah.
That's not what it's saying. So if you're scoring people, it's about social scoring of people. So if you're trying to basically say, Demetrius, because of Demetrius's qualities in terms of the obvious virtue that he has from his, love of watching, highbrow documentaries on Netflix, therefore we give him a high social score, and because of that high social score, we're going to give him access to these products or services at a lower cost, or that's not okay. So it's those sort of things. But I think, and I come from the kind of the old school of data science in the early 2010s, where that was exactly the kind of the opportunity for everyone was, this unrelated data source might actually provide a clue, a proxy measure into something. And credit scoring is a really interesting world, because how quickly you pay your bills is not the only indication of how creditworthy you are.
Well, and let's jump into, because I see another implication with jobs and hiring. Does this mean that now these algorithms cannot look at anything on Facebook to determine whether or not you are worthy of a job?
So let's come to hiring. So let's kind of stick with the structure. So there's things which are banned, things that will be banned, and I should say I didn't mention indiscriminate surveillance is also in that category as well. But so there's a couple of things which are banned. The caveat is they have to be, the get out clause here is, they have to be to the detriment of the individual. And we can all argue about what this is. The great news about this regulation, if you're a lawyer, you're going to make a lot of money for the next 10 years, because there's a lot of devil in the detail here. The second thing, this is you've got to read kind of two sections of the regulation kind of side by side. You've got to read Title 3, which is all about, and it's particularly Article 5, talks about high risk AI. And then you've also got Annex 2, which is like, the bit at the back, which also lists out high risk AI. And I guess there's two things to say about this. They're treated slightly differently, and that's why they're kind of not lumped together. What is in Article 5 is basically is safety components. So if your AI system is performing safety in some way, then it's going to be caught by Article 5. And this makes it high risk, what the European Commission are calling high risk. And specifically, a few things are called out, which are aviation, motor vehicles, motorcycles, railway, marine and agriculture. Those, AI systems which are safety related in those categories. And again, a lot more detail behind this will be caught up by this. So self-driving cars, that's the headline that people are going to take away. And I've got a car which has got, presumably there's some machine learning going on in terms of how it's doing its collision avoidance. I'm guessing it's not entirely random, although it feels like it is sometimes, particularly when you're going around a corner and it sees a parked car and it just jams on the brakes mid-corner. It's just like really annoying, particularly when someone's tailing you. Because they think you're just being an arsehole. It's like, it's not me, it's the car. So those things which are safety components are high risk automatically. And then in Annex 2, there's a list of things. And the interesting thing about Annex 2 is that they've actually called out specific applications of AI which will be deemed as high risk. But there's a provision in the regulation that the Commission can add to that list. And there's some rules around how and when it will add to that list. But what's really interesting here is this list isn't static. And I think what we're going to see over not just the next couple of years before this comes into force, but for the next 10, 20, 30 years, we're going to see people arguing that this particular application of AI should become high risk because it's hurt someone, killed someone, damaged property, or whatever. And the Commission are going to have to decide. And if they do decide, it'll get brought in and it will have really big ramifications. And the reason it's going to have ramifications is the kind of requirements for high risk are, they're not trivial. You're going to have to put a bit of work into this. I would argue a lot of these things you should be doing anyway, regardless of whether you think your AI system is hard. This is just good practice, but you're going to have to do this. And the penalty, and I think this is the other big headline news, the penalty is GDPR scale. 4% of global turnover, or 20 million, whichever is the higher. We haven't seen many GDPR fines, and Facebook, their data leak, which they managed to wriggle out of just a few weeks ago, could have been the first one, but they managed to leak the data just before GDPR was in force. So well done, Zach. So in that list in Annex 2, and obviously this list is going to change over time, and probably will change by the time people listen to this when the regulation comes out, is emergency dispatch. So if you call 911, 999, or 112 in Germany, I forget. Yeah. So emergency dispatch, that's one area. Access to education. So the mutant algorithm that we had in the UK that allocated exam grades, and Boris Johnson didn't understand. That's high risk. No shit. So some of these things are like a little bit slow to the party. It's so this is the big one. This is the big one that's going to affect every company. Recruitment and task allocation. So task allocation, okay, that's only really gig platforms right now, but I think increasingly people have been thinking about task allocation, even in a kind of white collar work.
Can you explain what you mean by task allocation?
Yeah, I mean, like Uber, which driver gets the job? If you're delivering fast food, which cyclist gets sent to which restaurant? That's going to have real impact.
That's huge.
And I think in white collar work, I know of startups who've been thinking about how might you allocate white collar work using essentially machine orchestration as opposed to human. This is interesting. But recruitment, I mean, that's the big one. And I think it's fair to say, if you look at the big recruitment platforms like Talentsoft or Ceridian or Workday or SAP, we've rated on Ethics Grade, we've rated the cloud HR platforms just recently, and I think it was really good to see. Workday weren't the top in our ratings, but I mean, Workday I just want to call out specifically because they've published some really, really well thought out suggestions about how AI should be governed in a kind of in a more than just a regulatory sense, but in terms of a responsibility sense on the ecosystem. And I was really impressed by that. I mean, it's obvious that, you know, they knew that this was coming down the pipe, and they knew that this would impact their business. And but I think also that what I detect from Workday, and as I call them out, they're not the top. We don't rate them as the top company because there's a few other things we think are missing. But I think, you know, it's outstanding. I would want to say the thought that they've put into the fact that they have a responsibility to make sure that the AI systems, not just that they develop, but the ones that live on their platform, behave and act in an appropriate way. Why? Because they might only have, you know, a few tens of thousands of companies, but each of those tens of thousands of companies are going to employ hundreds, if not thousands, if not tens of thousands of people. I used to work for a company which was a Workday customer, and we had tens of thousands of employees. And so if you do the math, you know, you're talking about tens of millions of people's promotion, pay rises, you know, being made redundant, you know, access to training, all of those things potentially are being, you know, decided on by machine learning systems. And so, yeah, good. This is high risk, and now the commission is realizing it. So that's I think a big step forward.
Wait, but what about my question about whether or not these companies can grab? So now the scoring question, like, can companies or machine learning gather data from the internet? Like, I post a lot on LinkedIn and it's all public, right? Can now company gather all that data and make a correlation and then make a decision on that?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, the caveat here is the benefit I've got of looking at the, you know, Bill of Exchange Act 1906 or whatever is that we've got 115 years of legal cases that have been argued and judges. So if you ask me that question as relates to an act that's 100 years old, I can give you a pretty definitive answer. For something that's kind of embryonic like this, you know, the answer is we'll see. But I think I think it's fair to say that, you know, if you were kind of scoring somebody's suitability for employment based on what they post on LinkedIn, I think you could argue that that is, you know, it's a domain, it's a data domain that's related to the social, what the social scoring is going to be used for. If it's about the photographs that you post on Facebook or Insta, then it's got nothing to do with it and therefore should be banned. So I think that's the first determination you've got to make is the data you're using, you know, does it have a relation to the thing you're scoring for? Secondly, there has to be a detriment. So, you know, if you're doing something for good, then potentially you're scotch-free on this. But if you're not high risk, if you're not banned, then you're potentially high risk. And I think the high risk stuff is the important stuff here. So that means that you've got quite a few requirements to follow. There's a few other little things in here. Credit scoring. I mean, yeah, no surprise there, perhaps.
Yeah.
Access to benefits and services. So, you know, if you're getting an employment benefit and it's AI driven, then that'll be high risk. Criminal processes and court processes, by which I read, you know, it would be both criminal and civil court cases in terms of the actual court procedure. So potentially, you know, who gets heard when, you know, those sort of things, but also, you know, obviously things like sentencing, you know, penalties, fines, etc. Those things will be high risk. Policing. So, and we've definitely seen this in the United States where, you know, the AI systems have been used in order to try and determine where law enforcement officers are deployed. Obviously,
or facial recognition software to try and identify people.
Yeah, so facial recognition is actually specifically called out, or not facial recognition, but remote biometric identification systems are called out. You know, and that's automatically high risk. And the other thing actually that's automatically high risk is anything in terms of public infrastructure. So if you've got water utilities board using AI to monitor water quality, or you know, those sort of things, that's automatically high risk. And then the final one, asylum seeking. So those things are high risk. And so the question is, what does high risk mean? What is it? What do you have to do? And do you know what? This is probably not going to come any kind of great surprise to people. That's, you've got to use high quality data sets. Should make sure that you document what you do and have good record keeping. So, no great surprise there, perhaps.
Yeah.
Standard practices. We're talking about standard practices. You got to have human oversight. Interesting, you got to have like a kill switch. It talks about like a stop override measure. And I think in my self-driving car scenario, that's going to be an interesting one. I think people are going to talk about for a few years. You've got a requirement to think about the robustness, accuracy, and security of your product over its life cycle. You've got to also like say, I'm building this system and I think it's going to be used for 10 years. In a car scenario, I'm bringing this car to market and I can reasonably foresee people might be driving this car as an old banger in 25 years time. And therefore the AI, it's not okay for this AI system only to work for the first 2 or 3 years of its use. It has to be, they have to think about the implications long term.
So
I'm
it
sure
can't be like our phones that just go they just stop working after a few years.
Yeah, exactly.
You need to play for the long
long way. Exactly.
Yeah.
And the obligations on this, and I think there's sort of really two things which I took away, sort of practical things that organizations need to do. And I think the most mature organizations are already going to be doing this. One, having a quality management system in place. And you're going to hear that and hear MLOps. And when I read that, I read MLOps because quality management is looking at, the list of what quality management systems should look for is in the regulation. And you know what? It's all the stuff that, a good MLOps platform would ensure that you have. And the second thing is a risk management system. And, I've always been, I don't think have we had Pamela Jasper on the podcast yet? I don't think we have.
No, we had her on the MLOps.
You had her on the MLOps community. Yeah, that's right. So, so she, like me, comes from the finance industry. She comes from a slightly different domain within that, which is risk management and particularly algorithmic risk management, because one of the funny things I found when I was at Deutsche Bank or Fidelity was, going to, we have what we call the front office and the middle and back office. So the front office are people who do the trading essentially, and the middle and back office are the people who do the kind of the plumbing and the kind of paperwork behind the scenes. Do great disservice to my former colleagues. Selling to the front office was really hard because you talk to a quant, essentially, a pointy-headed mathematician type person, and you say, "Hey, can I come and talk to you about AI?" And they'll be like, "I've been doing this for like 20 years. Like, there's nothing you can show me that's going to be new here." And it's true. They wouldn't call it AI, but it's basically fancy maths, and so banks have really well-established controls in terms of how do you risk assess and risk manage the fancy maths that they implement. And first of all, do we know where the maths is being used? Secondly, do we know what maths is being used by whom, when was it last touched, who updated it last? So banks, get this stuff, and there's actually really, there's well-established processes, procedures, and rules on how you should operate. And so Pamela is an expert on this, and I think when I first met her, it was clear that her surprise, I guess, around this whole AI governance community was like, why do you all think this is like new? Why are you all kind of like figuring out best practice? Because we've been doing best practice for 20 years, so just get with the program. And I think the clarity that she brings to this conversation, I think, is great. She's actually going to be a panelist on our webinar on Wednesday.
Nice.
So yeah, quality management and risk management. They're the two things that I think people need to be taking away from this. If you've got a quality management system in place, i.e. MLOps, if you've got a risk management, well, what I mean by that is, have you thought about how this might go wrong? Have you thought about how frequently it might happen? And have you thought about the severity of what it would mean when it does? And there's two things you need to do. I'm not talking about the regulation here. I'm talking more generally, what's best practice. You need to be recording this stuff. You need to have a way of actually sitting down and making that assessment. And ideally, I think you need a red team. You need a bunch of people in the room who can challenge your assumptions and say, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? And just kick that around a bit. And so, best practice is you know where all of your models are across your organization. You've got a way of monitoring them for quality, and you've risk assessed them. And there's going to be some things which you say, like, this is low risk. This is not so important. If this goes wrong, it's not going to impact anyone. No one's going to die. It's going to be fine. But that's great. But you need to know, what those are. And you should certainly, have that index. But there are going to be things which are going to matter, and you need to control those differently.
There's definitely, like, with the data too, where's the data coming from? What kind of features are you engineering on that data? Like, there's so much that goes into the data that you're plugging into the models that you need to keep track of too, which is very difficult if you start to get to a large scale, right? So yeah, that's a really interesting piece. And I like this idea of, it's just common sense. Why wouldn't you be doing this? So hopefully it's just bringing a little bit of structure and what we know to be important. It's kind of forcing people to do that. What
There's
I wanted
two.
to ask.
Sorry,
Go ahead.
There's two more things I think people need to know, and then let's jump into questions you got, because I know you got a ton of questions. So transparency requirements. This is like another headline thing. So if you're interacting with an AI system, you need to be told that you're interacting with an AI system. Like, Europe's not the first to market with this. We've seen this in California. We're going to see this globally. This is maybe not in China, but we're going to see this everywhere. And so, if you're building chatbots, if you're building any other sort of system where there's an AI in the background, you need to be telling your user this is. So all the horror stories about GPT-3 and writing, fake news, we can be slightly less worried about that now, because if you're going to be following the law, because not all people that will be doing this will be, but if you're going to be following the law, you have to say this article has been written by a machine. Deep fakes, that's going to be covered. So that's great. That's a really, really great step forward. The practicalities of that are going to be a nightmare. I don't envy people at Facebook, but I never did. So there we go. And then the last thing. I mean, there's loads more in here we could talk about, but the other thing I just really want people to know, if they just take a few highlights away, code of conduct. This is the other thing, and it's kind of a bit of a Weasley thing that they've done here, which is to say, kind of, if you're not high risk, then we really think you should follow a code of conduct, and we're going to encourage you. And here's kind of what we think a code of conduct should be looking at. And so everything in that code of conduct is essentially best practice. And we would have hoped at Ethics Grade, we would have hoped for something slightly stronger than that, and a sort of mandatory labeling regime. So if you're using AI, you have to kind of have an energy sticker on the side of it. That's what we do. So we were kind of hoping for something slightly stronger than just simply a kind of code of conduct. But I think it's fair to say that most organizations are going to be looking at that and saying, well, we do this anyway. We do this because, we're good people and we're doing the right thing. And actually, we want to differentiate ourselves over, the other people who just follow the minimum. And so I think, for us at Ethics Grade, that's great. There's within a code of conduct section, as they talk about how third-party organizations like mine might interact with that, and so we think that's going to be a very positive step forward. But the kind, I guess, the big question here, and I don't really want to spend any time, and a lot of other people would spend time kind of saying, oh, the act doesn't go far enough, or it's badly written here, or look, it is what it is. It's going to be law in a couple of years' time. Let's just get our head around what we need to do, and we can maybe fix later. The only thing I would want to say on what I would wish for differently would have been, there's the German Data Ethics Commission was proposing a 5-tier system, and the top tier would be AI is banned. We're seeing that in here, which is good. And then 4, 3, and 2 would be levels of control. So in level 1, you can do what you want. And I think that the attractiveness of something like that, I know it's more complicated, but the attractiveness of something like that is you don't get the situation where people start to argue, yeah, I know that on the face of it, my AI system would be high risk, but actually it's not because of this little thing over here. And I think we're going to see a lot of that with the rules, whereby a lot of people are going to waste their time trying to argue that their AI system isn't high risk, and therefore they can get away with all the requirements. And actually, what they should really focus on is just putting a best practice in place. And sorry, one thing I should have said, which I forgot to say, there's a reporting requirement within here. You've got to essentially, if your AI system is high risk, it has to be registered in a database. So think, if you have a motor vehicle and you're driving on public roads, you have to stick a registration plate on it, and the authorities need to know about it. We're going to see something equivalent to that here as well. And so it's going to be burdensome, and I think this is the problem for those people caught up in high risk. Is it's going to put burdens in place. I don't think we can pretend it's not going to be. And I think the risk is, and this is something at ethics grade we're definitely going to be looking for, if people are trying to argue that their AI system is not high risk and they should therefore not have to worry about some of this stuff, that's bad acting. And we need to kind of guard against that. And we'll be trying to look for ways of rating companies based on that. But if you're trying to actually look the other way and say, well, look, a lot of these things which are factored into the high risk are just kind of what we should do anyway as good citizens, then we're going to apply the same things to non-high risk uses of AI, then guess what? We're going to treat you and rate you and score you better. And I think that's the way that we can contribute to this. Anyway, so you got questions, and we've got 15 minutes left. So,
well, I think the first question is something that came up on my LinkedIn post that I recycled from your LinkedIn post, which was someone asking. I just copy and pasted blatantly what you did, and I said thanks to Charles. For
I got an email from someone who said, I thought something about like, I thought Dee's insights into the AI regulation were really good, and then I realized that actually came from you.
It was your insights.
If we weren't friends, I wouldn't. That's funny.
Exactly. I am shameless about that, but I thought it was important. I thought I should, instead of just resharing it, because I know a little bit about the LinkedIn algorithm and it doesn't give you as much visibility if you just reshare. And so I just reposted by copying and pasting. But the first question, and probably the most interesting question in my mind, is what someone, Harry Berg, asked on the thread of that. And he was asking, what related jobs do you think will come into demand first? And I find this fascinating because it's like we spend so much time talking about how AI is going to take all of our jobs. Now, because of this regulation, we are definitely creating some jobs.
Oh yeah, we are. I mean, there's an easy answer for that, which is the regulation provides for a European AI board. I think I can't actually have the wording in front of me here, but it's basically a board of people who will sit under the Commission, who will ensure that this regulation gets enforced equally across the Union, so that we don't have one member state that kind of is the back door into Europe. Because one of the great things about Europe is if your product is allowed in one country, it's allowed across the whole Europe of Europe without any friction. So they're going to obviously make sure there's no back doors, and also that list, the Annex 2 list of high risk systems, that's going to be essentially expanded by that group. There's other kind of more administrative things if basically things pass conformity or if things are deemed to be like unconformist. Because I can imagine like a situation where a self-driving car has had an accident, which will happen. Let's not pretend it won't. And then it's a kind of failure of the AI system in a safety. There's going to be people that are going to say this should be, this should be high risk, or the organization that had built it, didn't follow the requirements. And basically, that's the job of the board, is to try and maybe look at, as technology improves, where the spotlight should be shining, and also kind of making that assessment of, the post-mortem assessment. There's also bits in the Act about, or the regulation rather, before it becomes an Act, there's the bits in there about post-market surveillance. So, essentially, how are we going to kind of watch the operation of AI systems? So I think there's going to be loads of opportunities there for people to be in this kind of the AI police essentially industry of monitoring systems and reporting against systems, and it's all going to be bureaucratic and
well, do you think that the people that become the police, they are going to be held to a standard where they'll have to know pretty in-depth about AI and machine learning? Because I find it hard, or I would hope that it does not come to a place where you don't need to have an in-depth understanding to be a police for this, right?
Yeah. So there's, in fact, they've thought about this in the drafting, and I think one of the criticisms that people often make is that lawmakers don't know enough. They haven't thought about the impacts, or they don't understand the domain enough to be able to kind of really make effective regulation. I think that's really not criticism you could apply to this. We have an experts board, the high level expert group, which the commission set up a number of years ago. Some really top people on that who really know their stuff, and there's also a kind of apparatus around. And I'd consider myself to be kind of in that slightly outer circle of I've certainly exchanged my views with some of those people and given thoughts, and we've had debates and arguments, and this all kind of bubbles up. And the result is in the regulation, what we see is, there's a whole set of rules around what they call notified bodies, which are there to, play this kind of infrastructure of trust. Let's use Brian Carrier's language here. And yes, there's going to be some roles which are going to require, proof of competence, and those roles which are just simply going to be more administrative. So I think that's one area where there's going to be a huge amount of opportunity for some people and burden for others, because if you're in the business of making AI systems, there's definitely going to be a little bit more burden. But I think one question which I don't have an answer to, but I've always wanted to ask is, what's the kind of ratio of engineers to governance people at companies when they do AI? So if you've got 20 ML engineers and a few data scientists, what's that ratio to people playing governance roles? And I reckon everywhere that ratio is wrong.
Yeah, it's very low.
And that ratio is going to change if you're doing high risk. I think it's going to change anyway, regardless of whether you're high risk or no risk, or not risk assessed. I need to find a better label for that, because people will say, "Oh, because I'm not in a high risk AI, I'm therefore low risk." And I would argue, no, you're not. It's just you're not high risk. It doesn't mean you're low risk. It means you're not in a special category. But you might be doing what I would call high risk stuff, or you might call high risk stuff, and not be subject to the high risk categories. And so I think we're definitely going to see that ratio change in organizations, and that would be good. That'd be good.
Let's talk a little bit more about the 5 stages and how right now it's basically black or white. It's yes or no. You're high risk or you're not. And the way that I think you said the German AI Ethics Council wanted to map it out is that there's stages, so it's easier. It's like a spectrum, if I understood that correctly.
Yeah, and I think it's a shame that we haven't seen that, because what I understand about the Boeing 737 MAX incidents were that there was a particular piece of technology, the kind of the flight control system, and it had this component which basically tried to stabilize the plane. And early in the design process, Boeing decided to take a particular course, and it meant that system was not deemed as high risk, and therefore it wasn't subject to a whole bunch of what would have been a kind of pain in the ass safety and technical control things. And it was probably I'm not an expert on this, and so I don't want to. I don't want to commit any defamatory statements here, but I got the sense that seemed to be like a sensible decision that was made at that point in time. What then happened subsequently was that the system was changed in such a way that that little component was no longer kind of, you know, a nice to have, it was a must to have. On any sensible view of the world, it would have switched from being a low risk to a high risk, and therefore should have been subject to a whole bunch of requirements that never happened. And no one saw this. No one thought about it until they did the post-mortem on the aircraft once, sadly, you know, there've been a lot of other postmortems on people who have died. And I think the takeaway I took from that was that, you know, there's obviously the wrong incentive structure. If you're the organization, and the other thing that's interesting about aviation is that there is this kind of self-assessment. You know, there is a requirement on the designer to meet certain standards, but essentially there's some things which they can self-assess. And the way that the aviation authorities in the United States have developed over the years, essentially it's maybe a bit of a revolving door between the companies and the regulator and conflicts of interest potentially. It's just a bit messy. And long and the short of it is if you've got that dynamic where you are subject to either no controls or tough controls, so it's a binary switch, the incentive structure is such that you're going to say, well, I know it looks like I should be doing those things, but actually I can get out of it here. And you know, lawyers are good at that stuff. That's what they're paid for. And I worry that we're going to see that. I worry that we're going to see lots of those examples that, you know, on the face of it looks really clear that, you know, if you're safety equipment for aviation or you know, agriculture, motorcycles, rail, marine, motor vehicles, then you're going to be in. Even the definition of a product, you know, if it's a safety component of a product that's not in one of those sectors, like a toy, children's toy, maybe somebody would argue, well, it's not actually a product, it's a service. And therefore, safety doesn't, you know, the fact I'm doing safety equipment for a service doesn't actually apply. I think there's lots of opportunities there to wriggle out of this. And I think the way that you mitigate that is to have an intermediate category at the very least, and say, well, and I think what they could have done is beefed up the code of conduct, beefed up the requirements that if you're not high risk, you still have to do this kind of basic minimum. And I think that would have been a lot better. And I think, I don't really want to dwell too much on what could have been, but I think if we look at the automotive markets, there's a minimum standard for what you need to do to allow a car to be sold in the European Union. And that minimum standard hasn't really changed much over 30 years, but road safety has massively improved. Why? Because above that threshold, the minimum threshold, we see the Euro NCAP scheme, which is a way of essentially grading cars from, you know, a 0 to a 5 scale. And, you know, some car companies like to dine out on the fact that they get the 5-star ratings or the 4-star ratings, and people buy them because of that. And that has generally improved the standard. So it's almost unthinkable that a car would reach a minimum standard, because most people are playing in a different place entirely. And I think as a market dynamic, that would have been really good to see here, like a minimum threshold. Anyone doing AI must do these basics. And then there's a special category of things which we're really worried about, which we're really going to come down toughly on. And then here's the banned list. You know, for me, that would have been the better outcome. But I think we can achieve the same result, because I think I think this is going to raise the bar. I think we will see other pieces of regulation. I mean, GDPR spawned copies around the world. Yeah. This will spawn copies around the world. We'll see Australia, the United States, Canada, Singapore, other places introduce similar types of controls. And my hope is one of those other jurisdictions puts a minimum bar in place. And if they do, then I think we'll start to see, you know, that carry over here as well. The one thing which is a total no-brainer, and we really got to get somebody on the podcast to talk about this specifically, is that if you, there's been loads of research done that ordinary people really want AI banned in certain cases in military contexts. And is, you know, given the fact we live in a democracy, and surely the political acts should follow the views of the people. I'm just amazed that we've seen, you know, a year on, the commission carve out scope. This does not apply to weapons or military uses, and obviously we know why. There's a huge amount of lobbying. There's a huge economy around, you know, the military supply chain, and obviously AI is a is a potential differentiator in any future conflict. I'm not going to pretend that it is, and it has a potential to really massively reduce the amount of collateral cost of human life. But we need a Geneva Convention on AI.
Yeah, that's very true. What besides military do you feel like should be banned and didn't get banned?
Oh God, what should be banned? But the thing that jumps to mind, which is completely out of scope for this, but is for scope for something else, is not so much changing the rules we've got, but just using the rules we've got better. We've got antitrust regulations. A lot of the ill that happens from the tech industry is simply because of scale and overreach. And a lot of these companies are too big to fail, and therefore we kind of pander to them somewhat. And I think we need to see not new rules around antitrust, but I think we need to see the existing rules just used more.
Excellent.
And I think I guess the only thing maybe I think about that could be different is I think now we've seen this Facebook data breach and the fact that it happened conveniently just before GDPR came into force. I mean, maybe some of these things need to be retrospectively applied. There is a little bit of that in this regulation, but that's a conversation for another day. Dee, I've got to run. I've got a conversation with one of the big evil tech companies. So, but I'll be nice to them.
Yeah. Thank you for coming on here and explaining this to me.
I will see you soon, buddy.